On this episode of Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene, we are joined by award-winning author Amy Nathan and Mr. Keith Plessy of the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation, who will speak with us about how community collaborations help heal history. This episode originally aired April 21st, 2021. Welcome to Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene. I am your host this afternoon, Lane Cobb, and my co-host, Reverend Eugene Holden, is traveling today, so I'm flying solo this afternoon. So you're stuck with me. How about that? Today, we have a really juicy topic, and our topic is bringing people together, reconciling separate but equal. And we're going to be talking about the landmark Plessy versus Ferguson case that actually was the groundwork for separate but equal legislation that led to the Jim Crow laws that actually set the groundwork for the systemic racism that we see here now. And we're going to connect the dots for you a little bit. We have here an award-winning author. Her name is Amy Nathan. And she is a historian and a racial justice advocate. Her latest book, Together, an inspiring response to the separate but equal Supreme Court decision that divided America, actually discusses that landmark Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which was in 1896. So again, that set the legal basis for racial segregation in the United States. In this book, she describes the reconciliation between the descendants of the key players in that case, Mr. Keith Plessy and Ms. Pheobe Ferguson. And together they founded the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation, spreading their message that their mutual history can be a tool to create unity and understanding and sharing their vision for true democracy in the 21st century. We are also very pleased to have Mr. Plessy here also. So among other things, they're going to help us explore the question, how might we work together to promote anti-racism? Ms. Nathan has published several books on racism and the civil rights movement, and you can find her books and as well as information about the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation online. Right now, I'd like to turn the floor over to our guest speakers, Amy Nathan and Keith Plessy, and please talk a little bit about the book and about the decision and what you all have created around working together.
Well, thanks, Lane. So I'm just going to screen share now and show a brief PowerPoint on the book and on the work of the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation. So let's see if I can do this correctly. There it is. Can you all see it? Okay, so as Lane explained, this is a book about bringing people together. And here, I'm going to try to eliminate me from the screen. It's a book about bringing people together, describing the work of the foundation that is trying to do just that, trying to undo some of the damage caused by the Plessy versus Ferguson Foundation decision of 1896. The book takes a personal approach to describing that case. Here, I have to look. Okay, there we go. By presenting it through the experiences of two individuals that we meet in chapter 1 as young children, Keith Plessy and Pheobe Ferguson. And here they are on the very first page of the book with their second grade school photographs. They were both born in 1957, but they never met as children. In chapter 1, they described their first encounters with segregation as young children in New Orleans and the confusion those experiences caused for both of them. The first chapter ends by noting that they did eventually meet as adults, and by then they had both learned of their connection to the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. And because of two famous ancestors of them had met together in 1892 in a New Orleans courtroom that led to the case. Keith's famous ancestor was Homer Plessy, his great-grandfather's cousin, the Black man who was arrested in 1892 in New Orleans for sitting in a train car for white passengers. Phoebe's ancestor was her great-great-grandfather, John Howard Ferguson, the judge who ruled against Homer Plessy in a New Orleans courtroom, causing the case to go to the Supreme Court. And it was there that their names became linked in history when the Supreme Court ruled against Homer Plessy also in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, creating the legal underpinning for the Jim Crow era with the separate but equal idea that separating people by skin color was okay as long as the separate facilities for Black people were equal to those for white people. But as we all know, the facilities were never equal. So this picture shows some of the images that are of Jim Crow that are easy to show in photographs, but the book also goes into all the other kinds of impact that the Jim Crow era had on life, both in the Jim Crow era and lasting to today. So then the following few chapters describe how their ancestors met and the case. So in chapter 2, we introduce Homer Plessy. There's no photograph of Homer Plessy. So instead, I use this photograph of a young teenager who portrayed Homer Plessy in a play that teenagers created themselves about the impact on their own lives of the Homer Plessy story. So that can help the personal connection in the book start right from the very beginning, because it might imply that, well, you can find your own personal connection to the Homer Plessy story. Keith, however, did have a photograph of his great-grandfather, and he made this drawing of him. So chapter 2 has a roller coaster ride of emotions covering pre-Civil War, when free people of color in Louisiana had next to no rights, and enslaved people, of course, had no rights, through to the Reconstruction era, which started out very hopeful with new rights coming from the 3 new amendments added to the Constitution, but those hopes were soon dashed as white supremacists regained control. And in 1890, they passed a law called the Separate Car Act that segregated trains again. And the Black community decided it had to challenge that law to prevent more such laws being passed. And Homer Plessy, age 29, volunteered to be arrested in a test case to test the constitutionality of that law. So chapters 3 and 4 describe the really impressive civil rights movement that the Black community had, the Citizens Committee in New Orleans, to oppose that law and arrange for Homer Plessy to be arrested, and then for the case to make its way through the courts to the Supreme Court. Now, in the book, I include a lot of art. The art on the cover and several artwork in the book too come from a mural done by an amazing artist in New Orleans, I.O. Scott, which tells a story. You'll notice in this excerpt from his mural, you see all the signs on in the picture the words are written backwards. That's because that's what it must have felt like in 1890 as the Black community saw their rights being snatched away, as history was going backwards. Chapter 5 discusses the courtroom showdown at the Supreme Court. And chapters 6 and 7 describe the rise and the official fall of separate but equal, but it also describes the lasting impact of that era on today, with voter suppression still very active, mass arrests, neighborhood segregation, redlining, unequal education, and more. Lots of different impacts that devastating case had, even though it was officially overturned by Brown versus Board of Education and officially overturned by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But as we all know, the impact of Jim Crow still exists. And I just want to call to your mind that even though they lost in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, they were very proud. The citizens of New Orleans were very proud of what they had done. And this is their statement in their final report, that we, as free men, still believe that we were right and our cause is sacred. And of course, with the Brown versus Board of Education, they proved that they were right, at least according to that Supreme Court. Chapters 8 to 11 describe the work of the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation. When Keith and Phoebe finally met in 2004, thanks to author Keith Weldon Medley, who wrote an amazing book on the civil rights case that the Citizens Committee launched. he arranged actually for them to meet. And it was through him that they both learned much more about the case than they had ever learned on their own. They met at a book signing for the Medley book. And Phoebe was so upset and embarrassed to meet someone named Plessy that she immediately started apologizing. And Keith just laughed and said, "You weren't alive during that time. I wasn't either. It's time for us to change that whole narrative." So they were amazed at that their friends couldn't believe that someone named Plessy could ever be friends with someone named Ferguson. Their names had been seen for so long as direct opposites in history. But some of their other friends also had a sense that this marked a kind of national reconciliation of their two families becoming friends and working together. And so they and their friends decided to build on that sense of reconciliation and founded the Plessy Ferguson Foundation in 2009, which is committed to teaching the history of the landmark case, Plessy versus Ferguson, its historic impact on African Americans, and how we can learn from the past to create a more just and equitable future. And so that's the main strategy that this foundation uses, is to provide education and make it available to people. And they do that by putting up historical markers and holding public meetings. And this was their very first marker that they put up. It was on the Plessy case, very near to where he was arrested in 1892. As Keith says in the book, that their goal was to gather the right information through research and put it out there, make it available to people. He actually started doing that before he really even learned about his direct link to Homer Plessy, when he was invited by his old elementary school to draw portraits to decorate the walls of the school of Black heroes that could serve as role models to the students. Unfortunately, that school was pretty devastatingly damaged by Hurricane Katrina, but they have plans now to try to rehabilitate that school, and maybe Keith can tell us about that in a few minutes. They also do every year a Plessy Day ceremony on June 7th, and I want to try to suggest to you all, your groups and churches that you're working with probably do Juneteenth ceremonies to honor Juneteenth, and I'm suggesting that you might want to pair it with a Plessy Day ceremony. They hold a Plessy Day event every year to celebrate June 7th, the date in 1892 when Homer Plessy was arrested. It's now recognized as an official day of observance in Louisiana. So in 2010 ceremony, they had that play that the teenagers created where they found the link to separateness that separate but equal fostered in their own lives. They've also held a mock trial on the case. They have speeches by legal and academic experts, musical performances, and they collaborate with other New Orleans groups. And most interesting, they have panel discussions with other descendants of civil rights cases, descendants of Dred Scott case and of the Brown versus Board of Education case. And they're planning a day-long event in May 18th, and once we get specifics on that, we'll pass it along to Lane, and she can pass it along to all of you for the 125th anniversary of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, and hopefully we can hear from Keith more on that too. But the book also describes other groups who are using other approaches to bringing people together. One is a group that they've worked very closely with the three of the four little girls who desegregated Louisiana schools in 1960. Gail Etienne, Tessie Prevost, and Leona Tate. You can see them in the photograph on the right at the installation of a historical marker about their milestone event from 1960 that was installed in 2010 by Leona Tate's Foundation and the Plessy versus Ferguson Foundation working together. And there you'll see these older white gentlemen on the ends there. They were the federal marshals who had to accompany these children to school in the school year of 1960 to protect them from the terrible experiences they had at the hands of the white mobs that gathered outside of the school to harass these children. So they then went and registered the old school, which is no longer used as a school, in the National Register for Historic Places. They got a grant from the National Park Service. They did fundraising, and they now have own that building, and it's now called the TEP Interpretive Center, named for Tate, Etienne, and Prevost, the last names of the three young women. There was a fourth girl who integrated schools, who's much more famous case, Ruby Bridges, but she integrated a different school. And so the TEP Center is going to have a museum on New Orleans civil rights history. It's going to have subsidized apartments for seniors, and it's going to have a community university that's going to teach anti-racism courses given by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. So that's another approach to trying to bring people together. In the afterword on the book, I describe a few other approaches. One is an official Truth and Reconciliation Commission established by the state of Maryland 2 years ago to investigate the 45 known examples of lynching that took place in the state. So they're going to collect information, and then they're going to have an official truth and reconciliation process. In the resources listed that Lane passed out to you yesterday, I list links to other groups who are also, there have been several other groups who have done official truth and reconciliation commissions in the United States. The Equal Justice Initiative is also mentioned in the afterword of the book, and as you probably are familiar with their work for this amazing museum that they have in Montgomery, but their effort to try to get people from around the country to investigate lynchings in their area, gather soil samples, put up historical markers in their area, and send the soil samples to be exhibited in Montgomery. There's also another one that I learned from Mary Cobb, Lane's mother, about a very impressive effort that went at the Joel Lane Museum House in Raleigh, where in 2020 they put up a plaque. They did a lot of research and worked with members of the Black community of Raleigh to put up a plaque honoring those people who had been enslaved on that plantation from 1769 to 1800. So those are some of the examples that we give in the book of different ways that people can try to bring groups together. And after, we're turning it over to Keith now for him to talk a little bit about the work that the foundation has been doing and that other people are doing also in Louisiana. They're having an official naming commission now in New Orleans and Louisiana to change the names of all those streets that are named for slaveholders or for Confederacy supporters. Is another strategy that people can use to bring people together. And then we hope to hear from all of you about your strategies or suggestions or your questions that you might have for Keith. So now I'm going to turn it over to Keith, and he can talk a little bit to us about the work of the foundation and what he's learned about bringing people together. So,
thank you, Amy, and good morning, everyone. I'm so proud and grateful to be part of this program. I want to also touch on the very first marker that Amy mentioned, which was the Plessy v. Ferguson marker at what was formerly known as Press and Royal Street. In the book that Keith Medley wrote, it's noted that on Press and Royal Street, Homer Plessy was thrown off the train. Well, with that beautiful mural behind it, the marker now has a name change on the street. What was formerly Press Street, which represents the cotton press, because actually at the depot where Homer Plessy caught the train, the cotton press was operated in New Orleans. And it was one of the busiest wharfs in the city. When he interrupted that business, he was then arrested, thrown off that train, and brought to central lockup. But now that same street that he was arrested on, Press Street, 5 blocks of it, he only rode 2 blocks before he was kicked off the train. Now 5 blocks adorns his name. It's called Homer Plessy Way in Royal Street at that corner now. That was an effort going through our city council with the district person in charge at the time was Nadine Ramsey. And we went to the city planning commission and the city council, and everything was approved almost immediately. When that street name was changed, the mural was being unveiled at the same time. So it was a very rewarding experience. Congressman Cedric Richmond came down, and now he's an assistant with President Joe Biden. He emptied his seat and he went up to Washington now. But all those things happened in that spot. And that very next spot that we put up a marker was the spot where Leona, Gail, and Tessie integrated McDonough 19, which was the name of the school back then. And by the way, the lady Ruby Bridges, who was more famously known for integrating William Frantz School in the upper Ninth Ward, Gail, Leona, and Tessie integrated McDonough 19 in the lower Ninth Ward. It's separated by two sections. But now that particular area, when we look back at 2010, when we put that marker up, the second marker, and it's called Civil Rights Pioneers for Tessie, Leona, and Gail. That particular spot now was recognized over a 10-year period. And it just shows the impact of a marker. When you place a marker up, you know, we do a lot of research. We put that research on there. We go with the state to approve it. And it's an official state marker when it's placed in that spot. And what we did was, over a 10-year period, continue to lobby to have the school renovated. At the time, the wrecking ball was set up to tear that school down in 2010. But over a 10-year period, all up to 2020, it was finally approved by the National Park Service, and the first $500,000 was put up by the National Park Service to start the process. And I think it's up to about maybe 14 million, probably 20 million by now, that has been going into that school to improve it and turn it into the TEP Interpretive Center. And it will be one of the National Park Service National Historic Sites when it is complete. And it's something that you can look forward to when you organize and have one of these markers put up. I think the last marker that we put up, Amy, you were here in New Orleans for that one, and that was for Straight School. And this actually was the school that the lawyers that represented Homer Plessy in the Plessy v. Ferguson case, those gentlemen got their degrees from Straight School. Forgive my life. It's going to go off and on every now and then. But that particular marker honored the people that represented Homer Plessy. And what Amy was saying about their plea at the end of that case, when they lost it officially in the records, but in the hearts and minds of those who fought to change the law back then, it was a victory, because it inspired so many, I would say, civil rights pioneers to come out of that era. One of them being Alexander Pierre Tureau, who was a Louisiana lawyer who sued 64 parishes in Louisiana, and by the way, that's all the parishes in Louisiana, for equal pay for teachers. And he did it all by himself. He was one of the people that, when Thurgood Marshall presented that case to U.S. Supreme Court in Brown, he was one of the people in the ear of Thurgood Marshall. He was a good friend of Thurgood Marshall. When Thurgood Marshall would come to New Orleans on visit, he would live with A.P. Tureau at his home. There's a famous restaurant in New Orleans called Dookie Chase. And Miss Leah Chase just recently, she passed away not too long ago. But I think the street that runs in front of their restaurant is called Orleans Avenue. It may soon become Leah Chase Avenue. And she housed in her restaurant on the upper floor many of the civil rights workers who came down in the 60s and 50s to change the situations here with voting rights and housing and everything it had to do with equal justice for all, which is our motto as America. We still need to live up to that promissory note. And we still are working on that. Phoebe and I are going to be working with the National Park Service for the 125th anniversary of the Plessy v. Ferguson decision. And like Amy said, when we have all of the details, we'll present them to everyone. And there was one person who will be speaking, who we know who will be speaking, who volunteered first, and that is former Chief Justice of Louisiana Supreme Court, Burnett Joshua Johnson. This is an amazing lady who just climbed the ranks of law and justice and clerked for a Louisiana Supreme Court justice before she became a Louisiana Supreme Court justice, and eventually the Chief Justice of Louisiana Supreme Court for the past 10 years. She will be speaking for the 125th anniversary of the Plessy v. Ferguson decision on May 18th this year. And hopefully we'll have some information coming up for you soon. We're working with a very brilliant musician. And I know everyone knows New Orleans as the birthplace of jazz, but I don't know if we were calculating at the same time that the civil rights movement of the 20th century could have been in its birth stages around that time in New Orleans when jazz was being developed. As a matter of fact, a gentleman by the name of Daniel Day-Dune, who represented the Citizens Committee in the first test case, tested interstate travel on those passenger trains that was designated for people according to their race. He won his case, actually. His case was thrown out. They didn't charge him. But when Homer Plessy stepped up for the second test case, it was for intrastate travel, which was the Louisiana law, the Louisiana separate car law that he challenged. By the way, Daniel Day-Dune, when I mentioned his name, he was a musician. So Homer Plessy was a shoemaker, and these what we might call working class activists back then. Mr. Daniel Day-Dune was a member of the Creole Onward Brass Band. And his father was Rodolphe Day-Dune, one of the prominent citizens involved in the Citizens Committee.
So if I could interrupt you, and I'm sorry, this is very fascinating. This is very fascinating, and I apologize for interrupting. What I would love to find out from the both of you, because you are so connected, because you reach out to people with all of this information across the country, I am wondering what you are finding in their conversations. When you reach out to people and talk about markers, for example, and how to educate people about this very important history that has a huge legacy for our country. I'm wondering what you're finding in people's conversation. Do they know about this? Do they understand how significant it is? Are they easily enrolled?
Well, about historical markers in the I've been sort of collecting other examples of historical markers, and I think actually Keith and Phoebe have had an easier time than some groups who use historical markers have had, like the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. Their markers have been shot up with shotguns, and they've had to reinstall their markers and create markers that can be bulletproof. And the same thing was another article that I put in that resources file, the Mary Turner historical marker, this just horrible case of this woman who was lynched. Their marker too has been destroyed by people just slicing it down. So, but in both of these cases, in the articles that I've read about them, I haven't spoken to the people in those two groups, they really have brought together the Black and the elements of the white community, have been working with the Black community in both Georgia and in Mississippi to install those markers. And so it seems like it's you have to go through a very elaborate process. Every state has their own rules for that, but it is a process. And if you follow the rules, you can get the marker, and that can help, educate people. And I think that's probably what you all have found in New Orleans. And New Orleans is a real tourist city. So you have people who are friends of Keith and Phoebe's who give tours to all these tourists who hopefully will soon be returning to New Orleans. And they have civil rights tours and they take them around and show them these markers. So it's a way of, I mean, and these are all stories that nobody would ever have heard of. I mean, I've found in talking to people about the Plessy case that many educated people that I talk to, they have maybe heard of it, but they have no idea who even is the good guy and the bad guy in the
Many
case.
of us don't know the legacy of our history. And
so it's a way of giving the history, but maybe Keith has heard more about reactions to visitors to New Orleans.
Let me just say this before Mr. Plessy answers. I want to encourage people, go ahead and start raising your hand. If you have questions, please do begin raising your hands. Thank you, Mr. Plessy. Continue.
Okay, well, like Amy said, it has been kind of easy for us because we have not met, I would say very little. I mean, might have been one or two bad comments that we've heard. We've had positive response from our coming together and for the work we do in New Orleans with the markers. People tend to gather around those markers, get that information, and it's mostly surprised when they see that, this actually happened in New Orleans. Some people think Plessy versus Ferguson happened in DC because it was a civil rights case. They don't even know that it started in New Orleans. And, when people find out that part of it, then they start looking into the other parts of the history. And they find that and New Orleans is kind of a small town in a sense, because there's a lot of people that I've talked to, some restaurant owners, some funeral home owners, and other people that didn't know their relatives were actually members of the Citizens Committee.
Yes, that in itself, knowing your family history is actually, a big deal. And that is why my mom happened to know about the Joe Lane plantation because we're related. So somewhere back then, my relatives were slaves on the plantation. So there you go. We are all connected. Gail, you had a question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Lane. I just have to ask if this sounds insensitive, please forgive me. It is not meant to be. I'm just trying to wrap my head around a question that keeps coming up with it. And it's around changing the names of streets or buildings, even, taking down the statues of, that depict the perpetrators, of racism. And as a Jew, I can certainly understand how honoring those people, how that feels when one sees. I mean, if we had streets around here that had Hitler's name or Goring or anybody that were perpetrators of the Shoah, the Holocaust, I know how I would feel. My question is around, you can't erase history, number one. Well, you can. I feel like I was raised with major part of our history erased. And I don't want to see the history that is glaring at us now through these names and statues and everything, that it can just be brushed away. I mean, I'm really torn between the two. And Amy, you kind of said you talked about the tours and, in New Orleans and everything, which is all great. But it just seems like we have to go even further, either have markers or plaques or something where everything was changed, or keep those names and statues in there and put down their real history. Do you know what I'm struggling with here? I just don't want that history to be erased in people's minds.
Nope.
I guess that's all I can say about that. Thank you.
No, to respond to your feeling about that, I think that, and my cousin Michael, who dug up all the information about our slave ancestors and our French ancestors who came from France and who probably owned slaves and who owned slaves even after Agnes was freed. You see, it's a thing what he always says, and he's a great researcher. What he told me was that you have to embrace it all first, all of it, the bad, the good, the whole thing. Now, when you go forward, it's always, you see, that story has always been told, and it's been told wrong about those heroic cowards, you know? So what we need to do, like you said, is correct it, at the same time, embrace it. And then, just as they were honored falsely, we need to honor the ones who were the real heroes. And a good friend of mine in New Orleans, Beverly McKenna, who has a museum called the La Musée, the FPC, the Free People of Color Museum, she says that on the hunt, the hunter always tells the story. But sometimes you need to hear the side of the lion in that story. The lion needs to tell the story sometimes. And that way you know the truth of the whole hunt. And, you know, in that sense, telling the story of the real heroes is very important. So we cannot leave them out like they've been left out before. The ones who statues, I mean, there have been some crazy reactions to these things. But I think that we have to embrace it all in order to move forward. And the same way the Holocaust is remembered, we should remember our Holocaust in America. And that's why I say people say things like, oh, maybe you should get over it. You should get over slavery. Really, really. Try slavery for a minute. I mean, I'll even revert to George Floyd for a minute. If somebody disputes how the man was killed, let somebody kneel on their neck for 8 minutes and tell me if they're going to live, regardless of whether they use drugs or whether they didn't use drugs. Or if you kneel on somebody's neck that long, they're going to die. And that's just the truth. And that's what we've been dodging in America for so long, the truth.
Right.
We just need to embrace it all.
Thank you.
I think there is a movement to talk about what to replace those statues with. And most of those statues, I mean, there was an article I just saw in the Baltimore Sun that the part of Baltimore down on the waterfront called Canton, they just removed a statue for the man who was considered the founder of that area of Baltimore. That statue was installed in 1980. You know, and a lot of these statues were installed in the 1920s as part of the lost cause myth by the women groups of civil rights, Confederate women's groups. They were not things that were put up in 1865 to honor the dead. They were put up specifically to support the return to white supremacy. So you have to take that in consideration about why were these statues put up. And from articles that I've read where people, you know, school children have to walk past the statue of Robert E. Lee, it's just very distressing to have to do that. You know, what does that say to you about your place in American history? So the idea is some people have had to take those statues and put them in a museum about why they were installed, what the message that people were trying to get across with those statues, and then take those public places and maybe honor some of the people who stood up to those and who survived that era in a heroic way. And there are many, many examples that just are not well known of people who were freedom seekers from slavery, who they could be honored. I mean, or heroes of the movement to win racial justice. So I think there's an opportunity there for community discussion on, are we going to take those statues down? Then what are we going to put up?
Thank you. That was very
And you
helpful.
know, and to the Shoah thing, we took a trip to Berlin. Have you ever been to Berlin? It's truly amazing what you see when you're in Berlin. They're called step stumblers. All over the city of Berlin, they have these little markers embedded in the sidewalks or in the cobblestones or the bottoms of buildings of, this person was arrested here, died in this camp, died in that camp. These horrible, that you just walk down the street and you come across these things. And Berlin has done a terrific job of not letting people forget what happened. So I don't think they have too many statues for Goering and Hitler in Berlin, right? Yeah.
So let's get another couple of questions in here. John Schwamm, you were next with your question.
Yes, as usual, Lane, fantastic guests and fantastic topics of discussion. But no, it's funny that Gail had brought up statues, because I had a question about that, prior to her bringing that up. I think it's an important movement. And coincidentally, I was in New Orleans, I guess, 4 or 5 years ago for Bayou Boogaloo, when they were removing the statue of Robert E. Lee at Lee Circle. Didn't know they were doing it, but I was there that day and just happened upon it to see the the protests and event. Recently, there's a movement to rename the square or the circle Drew Brees Circle, and perhaps put a statue of him on the now vacant pedestal. I know it may not be germane to the conversation literally, but I am curious to what Mr. Plessy and of course Amy think about that. Repurposing of those let's say locations of controversial legacy where statues have been removed, and see if that would that be fitting or demeaning to what it used to represent. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Now, I think I've been talking to the folks that are in charge of changing those street names right now and renaming some of the spots where the statues were. And they're still in limbo about naming the spots, some of the spots and the streets. But I do think the research is going to help more. Drew Brees came along a lot later than I would say King Oliver, who was Louis Armstrong's teacher and mentor. And in the birth of jazz, he was one of the big players. Buddy Bolden could very well be named for that spot where Lee Circle is. And I would not dispute any of those names, even Drew Brees, because we'll never know when we're going to get another Super Bowl ring. So that might be the only one in history. So he may play a major role, but I do know this about Drew Brees. And I know there's been a few controversial things said about the man, but one thing about him, as far as this community is, he has supported New Orleans 100%. He has been a contributor to good things here in this city. And I hope he never moves and lives here forever, because he's one of the guys that came along and did some good things. I know he had some controversial things also, but those things we have to live with. Nobody's perfect.
Great. Lastly, I will be in New Orleans on May 18th after being gone for a year, because you know what? If there is going to be an event or commemoration on May 18th, I'd be honored to attend or observe and donate if there are donations for your organization at that time.
Yes, please put that into the chat, Mr. Plessy, if you don't mind. There are other people asking about how to get information about Plessy and Ferguson Foundation events. All right, Tyrone, your question, and we'll need to keep these concise, folks, because we don't have a whole lot of time left.
Thank you so much. Keith, Amy, thank you guys for being on the call. I want to take this a slightly different direction. This whole conversation that's going on the right about culture cancel and about people really being disturbed that the racist history of this country is being brought up and in their face. And so what do you have to say about the concept that racism is systemic and in our system? It doesn't mean that every white person is racist. That's different from having biases and etc. But I think that's part of this rub where people say, if I have to admit that America is racist, that means I have to admit that I'm a racist, or feeling I'm being accused of that and then reacting to it. So I'd just like to get you guys' opinion on that.
Well, I can say culture-wise, it's embedded in our culture. But when you say individuals, people, that's what's going to change this, hearts and minds. And people coming together with common sense and learning to look toward each other and understand our differences. Nobody's the same, to just reflect on Phoebe and I's relationship. When we met each other, we didn't have any feeling about hatred or anything like that in us, because we had been brought through our childhood and a young adult life learning to love people. And I think, in terms of hate and love is much more powerful than hate. When you look around this world, there are more people at peace than there are at war, even though war seems to stand out. I think that, individually, as we begin to teach each other how to treat each other differently and to understand each other, I think those things are important for us to move forward in a different direction. Even though the country was built on, well, you could say crime. It was a crime. The whole thing was crime. And, we have a justice system that is flawed, and we're working on it. We're working on all these things. That promissory note, the statement of all men are created equal. If we start looking at each other that way and treating each other like we want to be treated, then things will start to change. But it's a long process. It's been going on for a long time. And I still believe that love is stronger than hate. If we learn how to love each other for who we are, not try to judge. There's three things. It's condemnation, criticism, and judgment that makes us look at people the wrong way. And we can't do those things to people and do it to prejudge somebody, to pre-condemn, to pre-criticize. It's just not right. We need to open our minds and hearts to understand it. And then I think the road will start changing, but it's a long road. We've come a long way. If you look around, there is a lot of progress that has been made, and we got to stay on that road. We just can't give up.
Better preach, brother. You better preach.
Yes, thank you, guys. So we have Robert and then Adine, and then we'll see if there's actually time for other questions. I think there may not be because we have 9 minutes left in the broadcast. Robert?
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So to be really brief, I want to appreciate the work that Mr. Plessy and Ms. Nathan have done. I have to say that one of the things that really encouraged me when at the beginning of this was that it was Mr. Plessy and Ms. Ferguson, that it was a joint effort, that it was Black and white at a real level. And I'm wondering if there's a way to, in looking at these monuments, or just in trying to really normalize things so that from a human basis that acknowledges our history, just the whole thing of you've got two. It's not just Black or white allies. but you actually have both sides being presented at the same time. And I'm wondering if there's a way to, if you talk about ways to replicate that model, because to me, as a Black person living in white America, it makes a difference to see that dynamic alive.
What do you say, Amy or Keith? Is there a way to duplicate that model? Now, I know that that's a whole lesson in itself. All right, so or maybe say that maybe give us a resource about the model.
Yeah, I think of examples of Black and white people working together successfully is it that it can happen, and some of those articles that I put in the resources show examples of that, because that town in Canton, Maryland, that's a largely white community, and they joined together with Black people to bring down that statue, and then are now discussing what to put up instead, how to talk about that, and so. And I was really amazed. You look at the article about the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. That was started also by a coalition of Black and white citizens. Now, apparently some of the white citizens were interested in working on it. They started originally to save raise money to save the courthouse where the trial where the man was acquitted for, killing Emmett Till. And so the two sides wanted to preserve that. The Emmett Till supporters wanted to preserve that part of history, and the white community wanted to preserve it because this is an important thing in their community. And they came together and found common ground in their mutual interest in this courthouse, and then that expanded outward to wanting to memorialize the atrocity of what happened to Mr. Till. So I think it's a process of, as Keith says, to see each other as people and be willing to talk to each other as people. But the more examples of that can be discussed, the better, I think.
Well, let me just say that I know that there are resources. There are many groups now that one can participate in that are talking about how to have these tough conversations, how to come together across the table, and just for us to actually be able to say, this doesn't always work. It's really hard. We're not comfortable. We don't want anybody to think we're racist, all of these things. And there are programs that can be participated in that will teach us how to have these conversations. And Amy, I can resend that list of resources to folks right after this, so that you will have those resources that you can look, Robert, and see where you can learn a model, for example. So thank you for that question.
Okay, my question is a little bit different, but that's okay. You got to get to other people. So that's okay. That's okay.
If I can
Thank
make
you.
a comment.
Please go right ahead. Yes.
Yeah. There's a group in St. Louis run by Lynn Jackson. She is a great-great-granddaughter of Dred Scott. It's called Sons and Daughters of Reconciliation. If you look up their website, it's the Dred and Harriet Scott Foundation in St. Louis. If you look them up, the Sons and Daughters of Reconciliation meets every year in St. Louis. And it's a combination. We gathered with them, I think last year before. And it was our group, Plessy and Ferguson Foundation, Dred and Harriet Scott Foundation, and the Brown Foundation, the three major cases in civil rights history. And one of the relatives of Tony, who first decided in that case against Dred Scott, is a good friend of Lynn Jackson, and the reconciliation that occurred between them was organized. Oh, we're running out of time? We're not running out of time. Okay.
Oh, yes, we are. But we go ahead and
But-
give the resource, and
But
then
the resource
Mhm.
is the Dred and Harriet Scott Foundation in St. Louis. And there was a reconciliation that was organized. What happens with an organized reconciliation, not like what Phoebe and I went through, is that someone has to arrange for the person who perpetrated the crime against one to apologize, and the other party should accept the apology and forgive them. And that's the tough road that Nelson Mandela had to travel in Africa.
Okay. Thank you. Thank
Does that
you.
answer your question, Robert?
Yes, yes,
Excellent.
ma'am. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and one of the links on the resources was from this foundation called the William Winter Foundation, which apparently specializes in doing reconciliation commissions around the United States, and they've done several in North Carolina and Mississippi. And so, yes, it's a formal process, and they in their website, which is on the list of resources, gives step-by-step kind of how-to recipe for how to do that.
Very
Because
good.
it's difficult.
It is difficult.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Adine, we've got about 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you very much. Wonderful speakers, thank you. Many of you on call already know that I'm a member of a group called the Montgomery Four. We went down to Montgomery for the opening of the Lynching and Slavery Museum. We are giving a presentation, our third edition, tonight at 7 o'clock. My failing that I did not get this invitation to all of you. Lane, can I send the link and the invitation to you as soon as this call is over, that you can share with people on the call? And if can that be done?
I will do that along with Amy's resources. Absolutely, I can do that.
Okay. I will also say that if you miss tonight at 7 o'clock, we're doing it for an Ethical Culture Society in the Bronx, which is also has hosted an anti-racism book club, which is about 90% Jewish. We have about over 90 people on these calls. If you miss tonight, then it will be on the YouTube link of the Ethical Culture Society in about a week. Our group of four is myself, an African-American with New Orleans roots, an Afro-Caribbean, a woman whose relatives owned slaves in Santo Domingo, and a Jewish woman whose relatives escaped the pogroms in Poland.
Okay, very important to have that multiracial, multicultural conversation together.
It's been an extraordinary experience for all of us. So if you can make it tonight at 7, we'd love to see you. If you can't, pick us up on YouTube. And I'm sorry I've waited till the last minute.
That's all right. And thank you for having the last question. Amy, Nathan, and Keith Plessy, thank you for being our speakers this afternoon. It was an absolute pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to having you return. Once again, Amy Nathan's book, Together, an Inspiring Response to the Separate but Equal Supreme Court Decision That Divided America. You want to get that as soon as you can. This is really a very interesting book and told very, very well. Mr. Plessy, if you would like, if you have a link to put in the chat real quick about the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation events, please do that now. Otherwise, I will include it with the links that I send out this afternoon. All right. Okay. Thank you all very, very much. We appreciate you. Have a wonderful afternoon. Please join us next week when we'll have another great Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene. Have a fabulous afternoon, and thank you so much.